jump in, if that's okay with everybody else. I really appreciate everybody for coming. And I assume everybody knows why we're here to kind of discuss literature reviews. I have some questions kind of prepared that I've talked with others about that we kind of thought were good ideas. We definitely encourage you all to jump in and ask questions. We really would like to just try to get a dialogue, discussion going, and kind of hopefully, I guess, come out having learned something by the end. So today we have 3 people, supposed to be for a representative from the library, kind of bailed on me at the last minute, but such is life. So we have Jeff Greene, which is a professor here at the School of Education, Janice Anderson, who's great enough to come by and help us out as well, and Lori Smith, who is a late stage PhD student who I was amazed by her skill when I was a first year. So I'm glad that all of them could come by because I've heard great and know wonderful things about each and every one of them. And I guess that's about it. I'll go ahead and jump in with the questions if that sounds good with everybody. Would you guys like to introduce yourself more? All right.
We would also encourage, if you guys have questions that come up in the audience, feel free to ask these. This doesn't have to be a scripted event, so.
Does anybody have any burning questions? You do? Let's start with your burning question.
My question is related to summary versus like synthesis. And I always get like synthesize, and I feel like I'm not there yet. You know, I still cognitively need to summarize first to figure out, you know, what in the world the article said, and then, you know, that's the push, is like synthesize. But any strategies for that? That's my question. What are some strategies for synthesis versus summarize?
Right. I'll jump in real quick because this has been on my mind a lot. One of the things that I do first when I'm reading a new article is I keep a journal and I outline all of my articles that are really important. Like some you just kind of glance at and you throw away, you know? But some that you know you're going to keep going back to, I outline using their section headings, sort of what the research question, hypotheses that they're looking at, the sample and methods. Should mention I'm quantitative, so that also makes a difference. And then the pertinent results and interpretations. I'll do that as part of a summary. At the end of that, I'll write a, it's usually bullet points, critique, or limitations, or how I think my work's going to enhance that work. So again, when I go back, because I create that at some point long before I'm doing my lit review, so when I go back, I go, oh, this is why I'm using this article to think about these things. I never, hardly ever, go back to the actual article. I get really overwhelmed with 25 articles on my desk. I go back to my notes, and then if I have a problem with my notes, I'll go back to the article. But I don't, when I'm citing, I'm not direct quoting very often, so I don't really need the direct article. And then in terms of synthesis and really getting to the next point, part of it is developing the thesis statement that you have, the question that you have, and I use the other work that I'm reading to inform that. And so sometimes they naturally come together. You know, I think, oh, these 3 articles have something to do with peer groups' influence on academic motivation. And then these talk about engagement. So I'll talk about these together, and then I'll talk about these together. But part of where that comes in is through the outlining process. And in that outlining process is when I figure out the major themes that I want to hit on. And that helps with the synthesis.
So building on that, one of the things I always suggest students is to create annotated bibliography. And so I created a handout, so we'll pass that around if y'all can have it, with some examples. Anyway, but it kind of is building on that same idea, is that you read the article, you write your summary. So I always say try to keep the annotated bib on one page, same as days. You know, maybe a third of the page is some sort of summary of what the article is about. And then the rest of it is your critique and you're saying how it fits in with your work and other things that you have read and so forth. So you have that critique. Now, instead of doing bullet points, I would suggest that you write it in paragraph form, because then often what you can do then is when you start putting a lit review together, you can cut and paste from your annotated bibliography straight into your paper, just do some tweaking in there. So then it saves you some work on the back end. But what I always suggest is you do these and then create some sort of database, whether it's EndNote or RefWorks or whatever it is that you're using, and then just attach the annotated bib to your database, and so then with the appropriate keywords, and so then when you're looking for, okay, well I need 10 articles that deal with student learning outcomes using virtual environments, and you type in keywords, learning outcomes, virtual environments, and boom, there's all your articles. And you have your annotated bib attached to it. But, I don't hardly go back to the articles either, unless there's some reason that I want to pull out a direct quote to add in about something that I think would make the point a little bit stronger.
So I think all this is really great. I don't have a ton to add, but let me just make explicit what I think has been implicit. You can't write a literature review until you've read the literature. You've got to read all the literature, at least as much of it as you can. You've got to summarize it for yourself. Nobody wants to read your summary, right? That's not a lit review. A lit review is a synthesis. It's your unique contribution in your way in which you put the summaries together, and the way in which you put the material together. You have a new angle or perspective on the body of literature, but don't hand in lit reviews that are summaries. No one wants to see that.
And kind of building on that, my program coordinator at Boston College is really cognizant of that. So maybe you are involved in teacher ed, might know some of her work. Her big phrase always was, "I don't want to string pearls." So don't just string together a bunch of summaries, and that is your lit review. And she says, "I don't care about that. I want to see the synthesis. I want to see the critique. I want to see what it is that you're adding to."
And you can't do that till you've read it.
That's right.
Well, actually, so I could push back a little bit on that. I really like reading. I would read forever and never write. I hate writing. I actually have found starting to write on day one, as I'm developing the literature and as I sort of find things, and I change my argument, but I actually start writing because I know kind of where I want to go with it, even with my ignorance. And so I have to start writing very early.
See, I would push back on that and say that you don't know what the literature is going to be telling you. And so how you might start grouping and the themes that you might start to see emerge from what you're reading. What you think you're going to find might not be actually what you find, but the problem is when you start with that preconceived idea, then you find things that'll fit in that idea. And it may not really be what the literature is saying. So you need to go in with an open perspective. And what I say is that you do these annotated bibs, you have a stack of them, and then you start grouping them. All right, this one's on virtual environments and learning outcomes. This one's looking at virtual environments in informal settings. This one's looking at whatever the other topic. So you start seeing these different themes emerge, and you're like, oh, okay. Well, this one sort of fits with this, so I'm going to put it here for right now. And this fits here, and then you start sorting, and then you start going through your piles, and you go through them again, and you're like, well, I thought these fit together, but now that I'm looking at them again, this actually fits better over here, so I'm going to move this over here now. So if you go in and you have that preset idea that I'm going to find this, this, and this, you're going to force fit literature into those categories that they may not really fit into.
So I think this is a good spot to ask the question that a lot of graduate students wonder. When do you know that you have read enough? And I know in qualitative research we have that saturation term. I mean, I can attest, I just finished comps 2 weeks ago, and then last week I saw a book and a couple articles that were on my topic that I didn't even know existed. It's like, oh crap. So when do you guys delineate when you've read enough? When is that tipping point?
The snide answer is when you've read it all, which is not helpful. I think saturation is a key piece. I think when you start reading things and you're reading the same thing over and over again in the same breath, you're trying to get a sense of, okay, I kind of know what this is going to say before I started reading it. That's a good sense. But honestly, I mean, knowing the literature means knowing the literature, right? It doesn't mean you have to read everything, but it does mean that as you go through the various sources, you have to have at least read enough about a source that even if you haven't read it directly, you know enough about it that you can go, all right, I feel comfortable with the way other people have summarized that. I don't think I need to read it again, which can be a little dangerous, but if you're looking at ways of making sure that you don't read everything, you have to feel really good about that decision.
And
honestly, it's a lot of reading.
And that's the reason why, I mean, I literally thought I had to read everything. And I thought, well, I'll never leave. I'll just be here reading for the next 500 years because my dissertation draws from sociology, psychology, and education, and there's all sorts of things, and computer science, actually, I just thought of that. And you know, it was like, well, I could read this, and I could read this, and I could read this, and so for me, I had to read enough that I could articulate sort of the strengths and weaknesses of certain aspects of it, but I'm still reading. You know, I have a draft, I'm still reading, but that also means I'm still writing. And I think the reading and writing process continue to go, I mean, for me personally, it's worked out that the reading and writing process continue together for quite a while.
I mean, I think what I find is if I start falling down this slippery slope where I find there's 10 more articles to read and then they give me 100 more articles, and then my question is too big, right? What I'm trying to do is too big. And that's when I go, all right, I have to narrow. But once you have a well-defined question, I think it behooves you to read as much as you possibly can within the literature that relates to that question. And if you find yourself getting overwhelmed with hundreds of articles, your question's probably too big.
I think you also can do something called like a literature trace, where you find some key pieces and you look at who are they citing, from previous, and then who is citing that key piece after. And that kind of gives you that conversation, because the whole idea is that, you are contributing to a larger research conversation. And so how does what work you're doing, how do your questions, how does your writing fit into that greater conversation? And so that's sort of the key. And if you kind of know what the conversation is, and you can do that by doing a literature trace, taking a piece, looking back, looking forward, and it's easy to find out where it's been cited. You have to be a scholar, you could cite by, you've got a whole bunch, and in a lot of cases, unless it's a newer piece, then not so much. But it gives you a better sense of what the conversation is, and how the conversation is going, and then that allows you to position what you're doing.
Any other questions? Jeff always says that you should wait 10 seconds.
Where's
So
the
it's
filler,
10
Will?
seconds
Where's the
to
filler?
find. Well, you gotta think during the 10 seconds.
I know.
If you feel it, then you're not thinking. No, I'm not thinking about the next question I'm gonna ask.
But if we provide filler like we're doing right now with the back and forth banter, it allows people time to think.
No, it's distracting,
Oh.
but thank you.
I have a question.
Work.
So I'm writing my thesis right now, and I'm trying to figure out how to put my headings together, because there's this literature review of theoretical framework that I have, but then there's all the other literature that I have. And there's also an element of legal literature review, which is court cases and legal briefs and all those other sorts of things. So I'm trying to figure out if the title should be literature review or it should actually be like theoretical framework. And I'm really confused on how to organize that.
Well, I mean, in some ways, one question might be, are there broader themes or at points in your argument that you want to make that might help you differently construct your literature? So one way to do literature review is by line of argument. And within each line of argument, you have a little bit of theory, a little bit of empirical stuff, a little law stuff, but you can do it that way. I have seen people do literature reviews where they do theory first and then everything else. Sometimes that works, but theory is like the major focus of your question, and you want to either expand that theory or critique it or put two theories together. Then I see like big theory sections first and then more empirical stuff or other things. But I personally like literature reviews that tell a story. I want a literature review that guides me through your line of thinking so that when I get to the end of your literature review, your research questions should be really obvious. I should be like, yeah, of course, these are the research questions that this person's pursuing. It makes total sense. I see how they got there. I see how they make a contribution. And often that's more of an argument structure.
I think that's also something helpful, if you can play around with some ideas and then ask your advisor. I mean, you can definitely have a dialogue on those things. I've taken outlines into my advisor and said, this is what I'm thinking about, and and also cite, the different people I'm going to cite in these different sections, and then we've had conversations of, oh, you might be missing this, or you don't need to go and put that in, or those sorts of things before I've actually finished writing. So it's that intermediate step. And I don't know, different advisors are different, but mine's been very helpful on thinking through how I'm going to frame the structure of the piece.
Is that helpful?
Mm-hmm. No, very helpful. I have lots of different documents and trying to put them all into one,
So, I think earlier we kind of spoke about this, it's just the idea of a summary versus synthesis. But at the same time, I guess you're communicating. I guess I still kind of struggle just with this idea of how much explanation is necessary in synthesis and in literature reviews so that people don't feel like, well, how in the world did they come to this justification? Because I mean, if it's just completely synthesis, I don't know, it's just, I guess it's just that struggle of determining like how much does this person know about the literature and what kind of assumptions are safe to make and what kind of assumptions are not so safe to make. And a lot of times in literature reviews, you'll see people, like I'm interested in SRL obviously, and they'll give the SRL theory for like the 10th time, and they've written 15 articles before that, and it's pretty much the same thing. And I'm sitting there, well, I mean, do I need to do that? I mean, everybody else has talked about it. Do I have to kind of say, hey, this is what it is?
Well, I think one issue is whether or not the theoretical foundation that you're using is in contention or not. If it's in contention, if there are competing models, then you definitely have to describe the model from which you're basing your work. So that's a key, and that's why you see that a lot in these articles, is because people are going, all right, I know that there's 5 different models of how students benefit from discovery learning, but I'm going to use this one, right? And I'm working from here, and then you explain it, right? I think when we say we don't want to read your summary, I think it applies more to the empirical articles, right? So we don't want kind of a point by point, so Greene and Anderson, 2012, gathered 142 participants, right? But there are kind of often contentious points that you need to illustrate to your reader. I'm coming down on this side. I'm sticking with Anderson, and not with Schmidt's model or whatever the case may be.
So, yeah, going along with that, like, for example, using the term gender, what does gender mean to you? Because there's multiple definitions of gender, and some people will say, who use gender, there might be somebody else who says, no, that's not gender, that's sex. So it's really important to define those terms and lay out, what do you mean by gender? What do you mean by sex? What do you mean by whatever your term is? When you talk about, computer games versus virtual worlds. What is your definition of a virtual world? Because some people would call a virtual world a game, other people don't call a virtual world a game. So how are you defining those terms and using those terms in the construct of your study? Because if you haven't done that, then somebody can read it and go, well, I'm not really sure what it is that you're looking at, because I don't know what the term, what this term really truly means. Because I think of it like this, but you're saying this, which is contrary to what I'm thinking. So that's really important.
I think the other thing for most of you at this point, because this is something that I continue to struggle with, and is a little different than publication perhaps, is knowing your audience. So knowing your committee, when you get to that point, knowing your comps committee, knowing your dissertation committee, and really thinking about what they know and what they don't know and what they're expecting to see. There are pieces that if I was just writing to my advisor, I would just kind of throw it out there. And there are pieces that I've had to include that I feel like, doesn't everyone know if you're looking at social network analysis, you're looking at peer affiliation instead of friendship? Isn't that, but no, the answer is no. So sometimes there are pieces that you end up including that like SRL, where you might say, well, this has been shown 10 times. Yeah, but you might have to do it for the 11th because your committee isn't necessarily the expert in SRL, and so thinking about who your audience is and knowing that and thinking about writing things with that in mind. They aren't writing, it's really, writing to me is the hardest, because if I could have someone understand my train of thought and my argument, then this writing would be really easy. But nobody else is inside my head, seeing what I'm seeing, thinking what I'm thinking. So the writing and the rewriting and the editing and the re-editing is really vital. And, or at least for me, it's been really vital.
So I would never assume that your audience knows what it is that you're thinking. And so even your advisor sometimes might have a little different perspective than what you think that they have. So I just say, regardless of the audience, define the terms. Lay it out there what you're thinking, because then everybody knows what you're thinking.
Definitions don't need to be long.
No.
Definitions can be parentheses, i.e., and parentheses, keep going. It doesn't have to be a long. Some concepts require more text, that's okay. But some, you can go self-efficacy, i.e., someone perspective, but you're done, move on.
I would also suggest, finding a mentor text to use in your writing. Find a literature review that you really, when you read it, you're like, oh, I really like how this is structured. And then try to model your writing off of that. Because, it's not an easy thing to do. And if you don't have an example, you don't know if you're doing it right. And there are multiple ways to approach literature reviews. There isn't just one way, so.
And as you read in your field, you'll start to get a sense of what terms are defined versus what terms are explained versus what theories are elaborated upon, which are not. Now you get a better sense of which you might need to spend more time explaining or not.
I got like 9 here, so I'm ready to go.
No, so I guess this is the last question we'll ask, kind of related to this topic. And it was down to how do you balance kind of demonstrating mastery of the literature while also kind of showing the limitations of the literature. So, as you,
To me, a lot of kind of scholarly discussion is about kind of looking at where the limitations in the literature are and exposing that and trying to expand upon that. And a lot of times, in order to demonstrate a limitation of the literature, you have to kind of say, hey, I know all of this stuff about the literature, but this is missing. And I assume that in order to make that argument, a lot of times you'll see people say things like, we are unaware of any literature that does this. But a lot of times in kind of me believing that statement is because they've demonstrated so much that, hey, I've done that. Just kind of how do you balance that with, you know, some of the other ideas we talked about? Does that make sense?
So how do you demonstrate that you know what you're talking about before you start critiquing?
Well, just kind of, and not doing too much, avoiding the summary issues, just, maybe what's your approach to that usually? Maybe this, no?
Well, I'll try to answer that, and then you can tell me if this is satisfactory. So I think about those broad themes that I'm telling my story by. You know, and I've got usually, I think I have 3 to 5, somewhere in there, at any given day, in my literature review that I'm sort of covering. As part of that, you talk about the theme, and then typically I'll talk about how my work will enhance that theme. I don't really think of it as limitations or gaps or holes. It's more the perspective I'm taking, or the little itty bitty thing that I'm including that no one's included before. So that's how I typically try to do it, but I'd say the majority of it still ends up working through those themes and taking all those summaries and really saying, what's going on here in the literature? Where are people contesting things, like in pure relations, selection and influence? That's all you hear about. Pure effects or selection and influence. We can't parse it. And then I said, I figured out a way to parse it. Take that. But, I mean, that's part of what you're setting up. You're setting up how you're enhancing some argument or adding a piece to the theory, adding a piece to the component model. So that's kind of how I thought about that, but I don't know if that was what you were going for.
I mean, I think the thing I would add, I agree with that. I think the thing I would add is, and maybe we need to make this explicit, it varies by advisor and committee to advisor and committee, but in general, your thesis literature review and or your dissertation literature review would be the weirdest literature review you ever touched.
Yeah.
Because there's much more of this demonstrating, you know, the content stuff, right? So you find committees very often asking students, well, I know that this model over here doesn't really relate to what you're doing, but I want to see that you know it, so just include it and summarize it. It's something that you would never include in a literature review for, say, a review of educational research. So there's a little bit more of that in something for a work product where we're trying to evaluate not only your ability to generate new knowledge, but that you understand the knowledge that's out there right now. Literature reviews in published journals have some of that, but my experience at least has been there's more of that kind of explaining the literature in the dissertation or thesis.
And comps.
No,
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I would say the other thing that you need to, like, in terms of demonstrating that knowledge is talk about your methodology of how you came to include the articles that you did include. You know, what were your choices? What databases did you look through? What mechanisms for exclusion did you put into place?
Search terms.
What search terms did you use? You know, why did you end up with the articles that you ended up with? And that will also, you know, by how you define those different components, it will also, you know, give insight into your thinking of your arguments that you're creating in the actual literature piece.
And I haven't done a meta-analysis yet, but I found Harris Cooper's meta-analysis book to be really useful for literature review because he sort of lays out how you go about selecting and deselecting items in a way that made sense to me. So that was a helpful book, and it's really pretty short, and he's a good writer. So. And I guess that would be my biggest key. I've read a lot about writing. Most of the classes, I think Jeff's class had optional readings about writing. And some of them I read at the time, and most of them, you sit there and go, yeah, I don't need this. Oh yes, read about writing. And you learn a lot from just the process of writing. You learn what you know and what you don't know. You think you're ready to synthesize, and then you start writing and you go, oh no, I don't really know what that concept is. Those definitions, me personally, I find the hardest thing to write are those definitions, because you're trying to write in a succinct way that sort of just gets to the guts of the thing. And some of those are the hardest. So through the writing process, you sort of learn what you know and very quickly get humble. Or if you're me.
Well, I mean, but that happens, I don't know, it still happens to me, right? Where I'll embark on a new writing project and I'll think I know where I'm going, and then I go, wait a minute, I thought I understood this, but I can't explain it. I mean, that's actually a good moment. Like, okay, wait a minute, there's something here I can learn, or there's a problem, and I haven't really been consciously aware of it, and sometimes that leads to really productive, like, ooh, no one in the field really understands this piece. Ooh, I'm gonna write about that, right? That's a really good thing. Even sometimes if it's just I didn't fully understand, that's okay. But your point about reading about writing is really important, right? I mean, there are style guides, there are advice manuals out there that are really important, but just reading the literature, I mean, the more you read, the easier it gets to write. I mean, I don't know that writing ever gets easy, at least not for me, but when your comps clock starts, if you're in a dissertation, a doctoral program here, or when you're starting to sit down and write your thesis, you should be done with a lot of your reading, if not most of it, right? I mean, you don't want to start reading the day the comps process begins. That's a bad idea, because you're not going to get done. You really need to have read beforehand. And that's why in a lot of research methods courses, they ask you to do a literature review first before they ask you for a research question. Because you don't know literature, you don't know the research questions, the ones that are valuable.
So, I guess, are there any common mistakes that you often see in not so great literature reviews? I guess from students here, as professors, that you're kind of like, oh, I wish they didn't. I know as a teacher, like, of kids, the kids would always be like, they would make mistakes, and I'm like, what are you doing? Why does everybody make this mistake? And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Are there times where you're sitting there like yelling at somebody at home because you see this again for the 15th time?
I'd say the string pearls, the links of the summaries, instead of a synthesis. That is the most common thing I see.
That's a big one for me, and then the other one is, like, let's say the literature review, I'm talking like doctoral comps now, right? So let's say the person has allocated 35 pages of text to the literature review. This is their substantive, publishable quality product. Of those 35 pages of text, 30 are summary and review. And then there's 5 pages on kind of, here's what we should do next. No, right? More like 25 or 20 pages of summary, and then 10 to 15 pages of what I want to do. I mean, the stuff that, the demonstrating, the literature part is important, but it's necessary but not sufficient. What we really care about, which really distinguishes you as someone that can generate and contribute to knowledge, is that last section where, like, here's what we should do next, right? Or here's 5 great directions for future research, right? That can't be neglected. You can't do that usually in 3 to 5 pages. You usually need more than that.
And personally, I think the thing that I see and talk to people about is biting off too much. And it's not easy for, I don't think, any of us to figure out, what that looks like, but especially when you're, in graduate school, it's very easy to just be like, oh, this is what I'll do. And then you're like, wait, that's too big. And so recognizing that that's a conversation that you need to have with people on your committee, with your advisor, depending on how things are set up, to continue to refine those pieces, I think is probably pretty clear. And for the comps process, really making sure that this is a doable process in the page limit allotted. So many times I've heard people say, well, this question I can never answer in 35 pages. And it's like, well, then in that meeting, you needed to help them sort of bring that down into a manageable form. And so, you know, again, those are conversations you have with people, but I would say that's my biggest problem with lit reviews, anything, it's taking on too much.
I've read a couple reviews recently that use quality indicators to evaluate the literature. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that and thoughts on doing that for maybe like Tom's question or just if you have any thoughts on
So you mean like, you have a series of criteria for each article and you give it a numeric score, like you got a 5 on methods,
Right.
or you got a 2 on lit review.
that? Right, and then, yeah, the ones I've read recently have been evaluating the evidence base for some sort of intervention to see if it can be an evidence-based practice.
I mean, I think it works a lot better for empirical articles, and it works a lot better mostly for quantitative articles, where, you know, you can really go back and say, you know, that methodology was flawed, your psychometrics were off, so therefore it falls apart, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
For more analytic articles, I think it's harder.
Yeah, I do a lot of mixed method stuff, but I read a lot of qualitative stuff, and I think it'd be really difficult to do that with qualitative research.
I do think it's really good to evaluate the quality of the argument.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
you.
But your evaluation of that argument might require more than a number.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, I think having some kind of summary that says like, well, you know, there are 3 main points, I'm not quite sure the first point was sufficiently argued because, that kind of information I think is probably more helpful than.
And it may lead to the exclusion of the article, so it depends on like what do you
Right.
set up for your criteria for inclusion or exclusion from the literature review. So you can build that in that way. There's also, I mean, with gaming, with stuff on virtual worlds and gaming, there's so little research out there that it would be really difficult. You'd be really restricting yourself to a level that there wouldn't be enough to really create a good literature review if you did that.
And when people say that they've done a systematic review, is that just systematizing the process of selecting articles? Or is there anything fancier that you do with that?
You know, unless it's a meta-analysis where they're really going through and coding the articles, usually a systematic literature review means I tried really hard.
Okay.
When you talk about systematic literature review, if you talk about, you know, your search terms and your what databases you went through and looked and what were your criteria and this is what got excluded and why it got excluded, this is what got included and why it got included. That's systematic.
Yeah, that's good practice.
And also, if you're doing something that's merging, I was thinking like the gaming, but also the methodology that I'm using only has 30 articles that have been published on it. So I knew going in 30 articles, so all 30 are included and, you know, are talked about. So that makes it somewhat easy if you know you've got a finite number because of how it's all set up.
So I think the term like research databases has come up a couple of times, especially when you're trying to kind of frame what it is that you're talking about, or how you got your articles. I know I personally use Google Scholar a lot. I've heard people kind of say Web of Science and IES or whatever. And I'm just wondering, are there certain databases that are not like looked on favorably? Like if you say, hey, I used Google Scholar to find all of this stuff, and somebody turned up their scholarly nose, is that an issue even?
I think you just need to use multiple databases, that's all, and then see what turns up.
Yeah, I mean, I think my perception that Google Scholar is liberal. Like Google Scholar will capture anything that cites you. Like I get emails from Google Scholar when I get cited. And I got an email once that indicated that a town planning document from a small rural town in Wisconsin had cited me. And it was a document about like, we need more roads, and somehow they cited one of my, I have no idea, had no relevance whatsoever, but I was in there, right? And if you Google Scholar me, right, that will come up as one of the citations. So with Google Scholar, I think it's, you gotta just be a little more selective, but it's a good source, there's nothing wrong with it. I think things like the Social Science Citation Index and PsycInfo and ERIC tend to be a little bit more conservative, right? So if you go to my Researcher ID page, the number of citations that you see there is much lower than on my Google Scholar page. Probably somewhere in the middle is kind of the right number of like how many good sources have cited me, if any. So you just got to use multiple databases. Think about who's citing you. Is this a good journal? That kind of thing.
Yeah, personally I use Web of Science, and then bring in PsycInfo. That's predominantly what I do, but I also have a set of journals that I always follow. So there's probably about 10 of them that are from different fields, but I know that a lot of my stuff gets published in, I don't know, social networks and, journals, social and personal relationships and stuff like that. So I have alerts set up for those, and so every month I get the table of contents. It makes it really easy to keep up with things, and especially as you get further along and you're already sort of writing, it's nice to just have something set up that's automatically gonna kick things in for you.
Yeah, so you can get emails with table of contents, you get an RSS feed, but you should have something.
So another kind of thing that I noticed while we were discussing is just that there is a difference between literature reviews that are like published as journal articles, literature reviews that precede empirical studies, literature reviews that go on dissertations, just a lot of different literature reviews. And I was just wondering if maybe you could shed some light on kind of how those are different. I mean, I wouldn't ask anybody to talk about all of them, but if you want to pick one, kind of like what were the distinguishing characteristics of that type of literature review?
Jeff said earlier, your dissertation, you're trying to demonstrate that you know your field that you're writing. So it's pretty comprehensive. It includes everything but the kitchen sink, pretty much. In all seriousness, it really is. It includes everything. It's the longest literature review you will ever write in your entire life. You write journal articles, your literature review, 5-6 pages, double space, that's it. You don't have a lot of space. So you get much more concise in your writing. So, you still have to demonstrate where that study is fitting in the conversation, but that conversation discussion gets much shorter.
Yeah, and empirical articles, and a quantitative empirical article, you have a longer literature review because you have to make an argument that this is what we should do. In a lot of qualitative articles, the literature review is very, very short, or one of the issues that Janice mentioned earlier, which is in qualitative research, you want to demonstrate that while you know the literature, you're not letting the literature bound your perspective. You want to demonstrate to the reader that I really was letting the data speak and letting the participants speak, whatever the case may be. And then you find more lit review type stuff and results of discussion.
Yeah.
So the sheer length is different across the two paradigms because of the goals of literature review. Quant literature review is trying to demonstrate that you have a solid argument for your hypotheses, while you're simply setting the context, saying this is an important issue to investigate, let's see what's out there.
And then in your discussion, you tie back
Right.
to literature.
Right.
What you found, why you found it.
Right.
all
So
that
they
stuff.
look very different across empirical arguments.
Yeah.
But then the lit review and a review of educational research, again, it's very thematic, right? I mean, you decide what's in there based upon the arguments you're making about the literature. Because you can read, you and I could read the same literature, same 50 articles, and have a different perspective upon what it says and what it needs to say. And so the way in which we construct our literature reviews will be different, because hopefully we're writing about themes and talking about an argument and kind of presenting a perspective that will be different.
And at least for most of the quantitative dissertations that I know of, you have a chapter, your first chapter is not only your introduction, but your theoretical framework, and then the literature review. And so you're actually collecting both of them, and the theoretical framework is distinct from the literature review, but you need literature to inform both of them. So that's important to keep in mind.
I think the other thing too is when you're doing like a large literature review for a publication is to make sure you create summary tables within your themes. So let's say, for example, you had a theme, this one's looking, this is a gender and science, girls in science literature review. And so one of the themes was representative studies, girls in science review, theme 3, nature and culture of science. So then what they did is they just created a table that goes in there that pretty much tells who was the author and the year of the study, what was the purpose of the study in one sentence, actually not even a full sentence, a phrase. What do you know about the participants in the study? Was there information given there? Again, just a short phrase. What were the methods that were used? And it's just basically saying, you know, theoretical discussion and description of feminist science classrooms, or case studies involving teacher research or reflections on student responses to course assignments. So, you know, just a little catchphrase of this is pretty much what the methodology was. And then what were the major findings? Again, short little bites of a phrase. And that is helpful, you know, for the people that are going through and looking at the literature review to kind of look and see. They can do a quick look and see, okay, this is talking about, you know, these 3 or 4 themes, and this is the type of literature they're going to be talking about in the literature review. Yeah, I want to go ahead and read this, or no, I have no interest in looking at this any further.
So, I think we're kind of coming towards the end. I know some people probably have places to be at 1 o'clock. I can ask one more question, or we can see if anybody else has one last question. Anybody have time?
When we review the literature, we usually look for published work. We know that there is a tendency for journals publish positive results. What about non-published work? Because, for example, from my dissertation, I find a lot of work in American business. There actually I don't have any public article about. Probably there are people that they work and there are other kinds of interests and they never publish their work. So what about that work? I asked some teachers that say that kind of work don't have place on a literature review because it wasn't published. What do you think about it?
Well, so are these like quantitative empirical articles?
Yes.
Yeah. Are you doing a meta-analysis, or are you doing kind of thematic analysis?
I'm not doing any, I'm just talking about, for example, in a meta-analysis, we should consider that non-published work, yes, because it has a lot of data, right?
So Harris has good stuff about funnel
Yeah.
study, you know, funnels. And
Right.
You want to talk about that? Or
You can go ahead, and then I can.
so, oh God, I have to go to the board. All right, so,
You don't know.
so if you imagine that there's some kind of effect, right? And this is the true effect. Anytime you do a study, you're going to somehow randomly deviate from that effect, right? And very often what you find is in the published work, if this is a positive result, this is a negative result. The published work looks like this, right? Super skewed, right? So what Harris says is that actually you can statistically model for what would be a more normal distribution and then impute these as missing data. You can treat that as missing data, and that gives you a better representation of what the actual distribution of studies might be. And if you can point to unpublished dissertations, unpublished studies, that give some support for this, you have even a stronger argument that when you do your analysis, you really should be imputing some missing data here to get a better sense of the variance, to get a better sense of the true effect. This is probably dragging true effect back a little bit. Is that the kind of question?
Yes, but not also in a statistical point for meta-analysis. Well, when we are simply reviewing and writing a theoretical framework, should we consider the work of those authors that are
Published.
not published?
It's tough, right?
It depends on what you're writing it for. You might be able to include, like if you're in your dissertation, you might be able to include some references to dissertation studies that are in the dissertation database. But I don't know really beyond that.
You know, it kind of depends upon what you're using those unpublished studies for. If you have a literature that's going one way, and there's one unpublished study that's going a different way, and you want to go that way, you're going to have to really convince me that that's a good study, that you know, like you really need to argue for it. On the other hand, if the unpublished studies are generally pointing in the same direction, and you just want more support for what you're doing, then I would probably need less text in literature review about those unpublished studies. But if you, I mean, I could imagine a lit review where you go, listen, this is one study, it's unpublished, but I looked at it really carefully, and here's all the ways in which I think it's a great study, and it's saying something really different than everyone else, I'm going to pursue it. I can imagine being convinced by that, you just have to do more work.
I just want to know what you think about it, because there is a lot of unpublished work, and in the area I'm searching on, well, there are a lot of work that wasn't published, and when I was writing my first article, well, what I did was I tried to understand who I want to quote and why, because I think that states a lot of who you are as an author. But in a certain point, it was difficult for me not to quote that work because it actually influenced my work. Just that.
Yeah, and that's okay if you've been real critical of it.
And I also think you have to think about who is your target, like who are you writing this for? You know, there's going to be certain journals that maybe would not want you using that. Other journals will be more amenable to it. So you just have to know who your audience is.
See, but you've got to publish your dissertation and thesis to avoid this problem.
Yeah.
Don't let it languish. Publish it. Need it.
Actually, I have one question. Piggybacking off that, sorry. I can extend it. So I was just wondering, what if that unpublished study is something that maybe is like an extension of kind of where you're planning on going? Not that, you know, it's going the opposite direction of everybody else in the field, or it's going the same direction of everybody else in the field, but it's kind of like, ooh, going this way. And you're trying to kind of lean on it just to kind of say, hey, this inference that I'm making is valid. Because it's kind of unique.
The whole literature is going one way. You've got an unpublished study that's going a slightly new direction, and you want to continue in that direction?
Yeah.
I think you need to make it, it's a little tricky. If you're just doing what they're doing, you need to tell me how what you're doing is sufficient enough to be different and worth it. If you're building on what they did, you need to convince me that what they did was good.
I don't know if this is a dumb question, but what are you defining as unpublished? Because it seems to me that if something weren't published somewhere, you wouldn't have access to it. I mean, are you talking about published in a journal?
Dissertations you have access to, they're in the dissertation database, and they're considered unpublished.
Okay,
Yeah, like peer-reviewed journal, books.
okay, so that's what you
Conference
mean by,
proceedings.
okay.
Conference
And
proceedings.
a lot of things that are under review or haven't been published yet. So I was part of a study at Duke a few years ago, and we were included in a meta-analysis, and we had not yet identified that those findings were going to be the findings that we published. But we were included in their summary set of findings. So, yeah.
If that's it, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it. Hope you have a great day. Thank you. Yeah, have a good one.
Are you,
Listen to the excitement.
oh, I know, everybody. Well, you know, I always say that over here. Yeah, thank you. So
You run a lot.
Don't run as often.
but everybody says.
I run around a lot.
You're
Thank you very much. Anyway.
Oh my gosh, she's getting so big and she's like saying phrases Let's He was like in honors, the basketball players were like, You need help with this. What's this?
Oh gosh.
Just really great personality and just loves to What are interesting?
I got that. I'm pretty upset at my planning skills as of this point, so.
I'm here in, fabulous. Well, thank you.
I mean, I learned a lot from that.
You're also fabulous tonight.
Yeah, I'm gonna have golf with me. But thanks for putting me.
It's all worth it.
All right. So hopefully it was helpful.
I will.
And then there.
Good luck with yours.
Yeah, I am going home, but I need to get some moving after. I need to go to my PA.
This one starts at like 30 seconds.
Hello. And like, it is very like somebody, like
It's in a journal.
in a journal. It can be like a book by itself.
Yeah, it can be a book in a book. And
No,
he's being.
I mean, when I just write my dissertation is a book, like by
Really?
itself. Yeah,
But do you publish it? Do people buy it?
yeah,
Really?
yeah.
So you find a publisher who publish your dissertation?
Well,
Or is there a particular publisher that would do that for all the graduate students, for all the doctoral students?
our university is a publisher.
Okay, so there will be a prize for your work?
Yeah, like yeah. Here's like different dissertations from Finland.
Okay, but do people really buy them?
Yeah. You can give them away, but you can also buy them. For instance, that I saw in a bookshop in Finland, and that's like a station, like for. So it's like. So
I
how
think
does
publication is either in a journal or in a book or in some sort of publication. But some dissertation just the dissertation database.
But,
chapter.
What is a dissertation for you? Is it like several articles put together, or what is?
A dissertation?
Yeah.
It's a study you did.
You did one study.
Yeah.
But can you publish one study in like one article, like for your dissertation?
I think you have time to do multiple studies. Maybe that's a better question to ask. Hello?
Hi.
Hi.
We have question. I'm still confused by this published, unpublished stuff because I'm from Finland and I'm kind of. So what is a dissertation for you? Is it like one article or is it like different articles pulled together? And
So,
like what does a dissertation look like for you?
gotcha. I think it's 6 chapters. There's a literature review within it that a lot of times people will publish. And that's
The
one-
literature review part?
Yeah,
Publish that?
they would publish that as an article, as a journal
Okay.
article.
Okay.
And so in my field, like educational psychologists or educational review are 2 journals in the area or whatever that people a lot of times will publish their reviews from their dissertation. And then they're usually, especially like in ed psych, there's an empirical study that you carry out, right? Actually, I think, yeah, even qualitatively, they would carry out some type of study. It would just be qualitative in nature. And basically from that study, which is, kind of based on the literature review, a lot of times people are able to get a publishable article out of that as well. So that would go into a different type of journal that publishes empirical studies. And sometimes I think if people are really good, they can squeeze out two like empirical articles off of the same dissertation, just because maybe it kind of went in 2 different directions. Yeah, so that's what I've seen. I've seen people go through.
But it's like your dissertation, is that like one piece that goes like from A to Z and like from like introduction, lit review, critical methods, and like
Exactly.
is this whole book or I don't know.
They're like 100 and I think they were talking about yesterday. It's like 120 to 150 pages of text usually. So.
Our
double-spaced or
dissertations
whatever.
are like 200 plus minus some pages.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean
So
that.
it's like, I think we're talking of,
talking
I
about
mean,
maybe
my
things.
different,
Is it
my
so?
dissertation is another thing than your dissertation.
Gotcha.
Although they both is called dissertations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you normally publish your dissertation? Or you kind of squeeze out different things from that, or you publish as a whole?
Yeah, so from here, like from my background, they usually it's pieces.
Okay.
But especially people like that are more qualitative in nature, a lot of times their dissertations can be kind of easily adapted to become a book. So like, would it be like for your dissertation committee, would it be in the state to be publishable as a book? Probably not. But could you do, a reasonable amount of adaptation to kind of get it in book form? Yeah, I think so.
No, because our dissertation is a book. So therefore I was like, okay, a dissertation isn't published, but a dissertation is a book.
Yeah.
I mean,
gotcha.
so I was really confused. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's just because of my background.
No, and I think a lot of, I think more and more graduate programs are trying to get people to produce like you said, dissertations that are books, so they can have those publications. And Kant's processes that are articles instead of it just being, something, and then it's something you have to convert. So to kind of, eliminate this double step, why not just produce something that can be publishable initially? And so, I mean, that's a big push. Some places are more kind of aligned with that than others, but UNC is not so close for us. Not that it's incredibly far off. But,
No, because we have like 2 different ways to go, kind of, in Finland. Either you're writing an article dissertation, or you write a monography,
Gotcha.
like one thing, one long thing. And if you're writing an article, stuff. You have like 4 or 5 articles in journals,
Gotcha.
and then you're like writing what is like the content, like the
What brings it together?
what brings these articles together and like the main stuff. So that's another piece in your dissertation. So in an article dissertation, there's like the main stuff, and then you have your 4 or 5 articles.
Gotcha.
But in a monography, then it's just like your whole.
Idea.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Pretty cool. Sounds cool.
Yeah, so dissertation at UNC would be too long for an article, but not in the
Definitely.
right format for a book. Is that how our dissertation would look like?
Probably.
Okay.
If I had to assume.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe with a lot of work, you might be able to get it more tailored. I guess it just, I think depending on like your work on the front end, it'll kind of, it will affect how hard you will have to work to get it published, I guess.
Mm-hmm.